Hey guys, so I'm here for a tag. This is the Poem for Every Agony tag, and this was created by Samuel Durham, who is a, not actually that new of a booktuber, but I have only just discovered him. I do recommend you all go watch his video, his original video, where he created this tag, because it's a great video, and subscribe to his channel. And also you should go watch his video because there's a good chance that he tagged you. If you are someone who would watch my channel, then you're probably someone who he tagged, because he tagged like everyone. Yeah, go look to see if he tagged you. I will be tagging one person, but he pretty much tagged everyone who I ever would tag in a tag like this. What this tag is it's a tag where you pick poems that have sort of been a comfort to you in times of distress in your life. And, you know, there are 11 different agonies, so to speak. I sort of have to preface my rendition of this tag by saying that I don't really turn to poems for comfort, per se, in the heat of the moment. You know, when something's just happened, I don't tend to turn to poems to comfort me, with one big exception. I tend to turn to other people, to talk to people, you know, and vent and such. But I think that poems do a great job of sort of, after the sort of big climax of whatever's going on has passed, and I have a little bit of perspective, a little bit of distance. I think poems do help get insights into different emotions and different events in your life. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it. But anyway, without further ado, I'll just jump right into the questions. And the first one is that one exception that I mentioned, grief. During times of grief or bereavement, what is that one poem that comforts you? This, again, is the exception where I actually do often turn to poems when I'm grieving over a recent loss, because grief tends to be such a long-term process. It tends to be very cathartic to read poems that deal with grief or with loss in some way. And there are a bunch I could have gone with, but I decided to go with Adonis by Percy Shelley. And this is a rather lengthy poem that he wrote when John Keats died, and it sort of acts as a long elegy for John Keats. And you know, Adonis in the context of this poem is John Keats. And the poem itself is also just a meditation on mortality in general. I just went and I reread the first stanza of this poem. It is, again, a rather long poem, so I didn't reread the whole thing for this video. I just went and reread the first stanza, and I feel like the first stanza is great because I think it speaks to a sort of hyperbolic way of looking at the recently deceased that I think we have, or that I have certainly experienced. I weep for Adonis, he is dead. Oh, weep for Adonis, though our tears thaw not the frost which binds so dear a head. And thou, sad hour, selected from all years to mourn our loss, rouse thy obscure compeers, and teach them thine own sorrow. Say, with me died Adonis, till the future dares forget the past. His fate and fame shall be an echo and a light unto eternity. And, you know, those words may have been true for John Keats, you know, that he would have been an echo and a light unto eternity, but it's not true of most people. Most people will be remembered by a couple generations and then be totally forgotten. And ultimately John Keats will too, because, you know, we'll all die eventually, so. But that aside, most of us will not be remembered in the way that John Keats is. And yet that stanza still speaks to, I think, how we feel just after a bereavement, because we have a way of sort of hagiographizing the recently deceased, at least for a time, I find. We focus on how, you know, great they were, in a sense, and perhaps forget at first that they were, you know, a flawed human being. And with the passage of some time, we come to terms with the fact that you know, they were flawed, and we come to terms with that. But I think that stanza is just a beautiful evocation of that hyperbolic idea of what a person was after they've just died. So yeah, anyway, that is a poem that has comforted me when I've been in grief. There are a number of others I could have picked, you know, In Memoriam by Alfred Tennyson, Liberty by Edward Thomas, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop are all poems that I love. But that was the one that, Adonis is the one that I had the most sort of immediate visceral reaction to at first, so that is the one that I went with. Number 2 is Being in Love. What is that one poem that comforts you when you are despairingly in love with someone? And this prompt and the next few are all a little bit tricky for me because I've never actually been in love. I've never actually even been on a single date in my life. I have had sort of not very serious crushes on people, but they have either they've either been in a relationship already or they weren't interested in the opposite sex. So for this and the next couple of prompts, I had to sort of work around, you know, the idea behind it. But for this one, I decided to go with a poem by Philip Sidney, and it's an untitled poem, but it is wonderful. It's a wonderful love poem. I don't tend to like love poems that much. It's just the subject of love has never been all that compelling for me. Maybe because I've never been in love, but anyway, I'll just read the whole poem to you because it is quite short. My true love hath my heart, and I have his, by just exchange one for the other given. I hold his dear, and mine he cannot miss. There never was a better bargain driven. My true love hath my heart, and I have his. His heart in me keeps me and him in one. My heart in him his thoughts and senses guides. He loves my heart, for once it was his own. I cherish his because in me it bides. My true love hath my heart, and I have his. I love the sing-song quality of that, and I also, actually that poem was recited in Elizabeth, the film made about Queen Elizabeth I of England, by the Earl of Leicester, her lover. So when I read that for the first time, after having seen that movie so many times, I was like, oh, I've heard that before. So anyway, that is a love poem that I really like. Number 3 is Unrequited Love. What is that one poem that comforts you during the agonies of unrequited love? With this, again, I had to sort of work around it, and I decided to go with a poem that really sort of deals with the transience of love and any romantic attachment. I figure that's a decent sort of counterpoint to the idea of unrequited love, you know. If you're feeling unrequited love, maybe thinking about the fact that all love is just transient and we're all gonna die anyway, maybe it'll be comforting. I don't know, because again, I've never experienced it. But the poem I went with is the song from Cymbeline by William Shakespeare. Hear no more the heat of the sun, not the furious winter's rages, or nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hath done, home art gone, and ta'en thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. That refrain of rhyming must with dust in this poem. So yeah, anyway, I really like that poem, and that's my answer for Unrequited Love. Next, for Heartbreak, the prompt is, or the question is, what is that one poem that comforts or medicates your heartbreak? And again, I had to sort of work around it, and so for this one I went with a poem that really strongly invokes loneliness, because I figure that's sort of an inverse of heartbreak. Your heart isn't broken, you just aren't with anyone, even though you wish you could be. And so that poem that I went with for this one is Quiet Night Thoughts by Li Po, or Li Bai, as he's now often, I think, known. But it's just a really short poem, and it's one of the most famous poems in Chinese literature. And it's very short again, so I'll read it to you. Before my bed there is bright moonlight, so that it seems like frost on the ground. Lifting my head, I watch the bright moon. Lowering my head, I dream that I'm home. Yeah, I think that that really it does a lot with only 2 images, basically. It says a lot in just a small space, and I really respect that, and I've always found that poem incredibly moving, so yeah. Number 5 is Dysfunctional Relationships. What is that one poem that stabilizes or comforts you when you are having to endure a dysfunctional relationship? So for this, I went with a parental relationship. You know, Samuel lists a bunch of different relationships you could go with for this one. I went with a parental relationship. I had a tumultuous relationship with my dad especially in my teenage years, but basically from very young childhood into my early 20s, I didn't have the best relationship with my dad. We get along much better now than we used to. We're still, I wouldn't say we're particularly close still, but we definitely, you know, get along much better. And this poem is Daddy by Sylvia Plath. This poem is definitely very specific to Sylvia Plath's situation. You know, it's specifically about her father and her husband as well, and sort of how her troubled relationship with her father affected her troubled relationship with her husband. And so it's very specific. It's very specifically from the perspective of a woman dealing with her father and her husband. But I think for me, when you strip away all the contextual factors, it is really just a poem about, again, a troubled relationship with a father figure. And so it really had a huge impact on me when I read it for that reason. I actually had the poem memorized for a long time. I don't think I do anymore. But yeah, you know, characterizing the father as a fascist and such was all very sort of resonant. It may be a bit hyperbolic too, because obviously my dad wasn't a fascist, but and he wasn't a fascist in a literal or a figurative sense, I will say. But you know, all that sort of perhaps in her case not quite hyperbole, but in my case sort of hyperbole, really resonated. Yeah, so that is a poem that had a big, really made me think about my own relationship with my father. Number 6 is Dark Night of the Soul. What is that one poem that comforts and lifts you up from the abyss of self-doubts and hatred? I don't know if this poem really lifts me up from the abyss of what is it, self-doubts and self-hatred, but it I guess gives a bit of tough love in that regard, I suppose, but it is also weirdly comforting for me. And what this is from the book of Job. It's chapter 38, and I'm going to go against the grain and say that for this particular passage in the Bible, although not really most other passages, but this particular passage, I actually don't prefer the King James Version. I prefer the New English Bible. And I will again read some of it to you. In this part of Job, God sort of responds to some of the criticisms that Job has laid against him. Job has sort of been lamenting the human condition for a long time. You know, our lives are full of so much pain and suffering. You know, God, how could you have created such a world? So he's being very accusatory toward God. And then God responds, "Who is this whose ignorant words cloud my design in darkness? Brace yourself and stand up like a man. I will ask questions, and you shall answer. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know and understand. Who settled its dimensions? Surely you should know. Who stretched his measuring line over it? On what do its supporting pillars rest? Who set its cornerstone in place when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted aloud?" So basically, it's a sort of unsatisfactory answer on God's part. It's basically saying, well, I know what I'm doing, so just trust me. Again, that's unsatisfactory, but it is sort of the only answer anyone's ever going to have to why this world sucks so much. We really don't know why the world is the way it is. We don't know why the world doesn't make any sense. And we all have to deal with that, whether we're religious or if you're an atheist, as I am. So that poem gives a great insight into how I think sort of when I experience a dark night of the soul, I suppose. Number 7 is Enduring a Job That You Hate. What is that one poem that helps you get through the drudgeries and anxieties of a job you hate? And for this, I went with a poem I've only read a couple times, but it's Poem en forme de ça. It's a French title, so I'm butchering it, but it's by Frank O'Hara, who is not one of my favorite poets. I read his collection Lunch Poems last year, and I can't claim to make head or tails of most of it, but I just opened to this poem sort of almost by accident and saw these verses that I had underlined, and I thought that this sounded perfect for this prompt. And I think the poem is actually from the perspective of a saw. So, like, you know, we're talking about drudge work and a job you don't like. You know, you can think of us being a saw. I don't want to just make boards for the rest of my life. I'm distressed. The water is very beautiful, but you can't go into it because of the gunk. And the dog is always rolling over. I like dogs on their little feet. And then the poem ends with, "And at the same time, the waters rushing past remind me of nothing. I'm so damned empty. What is all this vessel shit anyway? We are all rushing down the river happy times. ducking, poling, bumping, sinking, and swimming, and we arrive at the beach. The chaff is sand. Alone as a tree, bumping another tree in a storm. That's not really being alone, is it? Signed, The Saw. I mean, yeah, I don't know, when you think of drudge work in a job you don't like, just think of being a saw, you know? Number 8, the feelings of loss. Which poem comforts when you have lost something or someone? And this is supposed to be about sort of ordinary losses or mundane losses. Sort of like losing an object or, you know, some sort of personal failing or something like that. As opposed to more painful losses like the death of a loved one. And this was a hard one. I don't often think of poems in this context. You know, Samuel went with One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which certainly is the quintessential poem about loss, I think. Whether it be a personal loss or whether it be just one of these mundane losses. But since Samuel went with it, I'm going to go with something else. The poem that I picked is from this collection by Wisława Szymborska. This poem is called Nothing Twice. And I will read the first 2 stanzas for you. Nothing can never happen twice. In consequence, the sorry fact is that we arrive here improvised and leave without the chance to practice. Even if there is no one dumber, if you're the planet's biggest dunce, you can't repeat the class in summer. This course is only offered once. Yeah, I think basically, you know, that's not about mundane losses, sort of, but I think it does speak to sort of the fact that, you know, we're all going to screw up. You know, we don't have practice for this life. We're never going to do it perfect, so if we lose something or have some sort of personal failing or, you know, don't get that job or whatever, we just sort of need to accept that that is the status quo and find a way to live with that. And I think that that is what this poem speaks to. Number 9 is Fear of Dying and Death. Which poem comforts you when you are haunted by the thoughts of dying and death? I don't exactly have a constant fear of death. I don't think about my own death that often. Or rather, I do think of it, but it doesn't necessarily scare me all that much. The thing I'm mostly scared of is pain with relation to death, is dying, you know, a slow and painful death. Because I feel like, you know, the world was doing just fine before you were born, so it's probably going to do just fine after you die. And more personally, you were doing just fine before you were born, so therefore you'll probably be doing just fine after you die. And also, after you die, you won't be conscious anymore to care about the fact that you're dead. So I don't have this fear of death that comes over me that often, but a poem that really does, I think, speak to my own perspective on death that I have just expressed is Sunday Morning by Wallace Stevens, which you've heard me talk about far too much. This is my favorite poem of all time by one of my favorite poet, and yeah, it's a poem just about what we're to do with this world if we don't believe in a sort of divine presence of any sort. And one of the conclusions that Wallace Stevens comes to, or one of the ideas that he proposes, is probably a better way to put it, is that it's really death and transience from which this world takes much of its beauty. If things lasted forever, they wouldn't seem as beautiful as if they were transient, or as if we weren't transient and didn't realize that we only have a limited time to experience them. And you know, I'll read just a few verses that I really speak to this idea. There are 2 great moments in the poem where he actually says death is the mother of beauty, and both moments are like my favorite moments in poetry. Death is the mother of beauty. Hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and our desires. Although she strews the leaves of sure obliteration on our paths, the path sick sorrow took, the many paths where triumph rang its brassy phrase, or love whispered a little out of tenderness, she makes the willow shiver in the sun, for maidens who were wont to sit and gaze upon the grass, relinquished to their feet. And the second one is Death is the mother of beauty, mystical, within whose burning bosom we devise our earthly mothers, waiting sleeplessly. Number 10 is Rejection. Which poem helps you to heal the wounds of a rejection? Rejection for me is sort of a weird, constant anxiety, really. I have this weird feeling whenever I'm talking to someone who I am not, like, best friends with, that if they're talking to me, they would probably rather be doing something else. And so that makes it really hard for me to make friends, because I find it hard to ask people to spend time around me and to do things. So it's a lot of constant anxiety, and I think a poem that really discusses dealing with anxiety is I Give You Back by Joy Harjo. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that Joy Harjo just recently became the first Native American poet to be named the Poet Laureate of the United States, so that is awesome and much deserved. And this poem is sort of about fear and overcoming fear, not necessarily fear of rejection, certainly, but just fear in general. And Joy Harjo actually wrote this poem in part about an experience that she had with panic disorder. She had chronic panic attacks for a good portion of her youth. Writing poetry was one of the things that helped her to recover from it. And you'll read about this if you ever read her memoir, Crazy Brave, which I have read and really liked. And again, I will read you some of the verses from it. I release you, fear, because you hold these scenes in front of me, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you, fear, so you can no longer keep me naked and frozen in the winter, or smothered under blankets in the summer. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or in my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart. But come here, fear. I am alive, and you are so afraid of dying. And I think that last verse really speaks to how it's almost impossible to completely do away with fear or anxiety, and I think that is an important but sad fact of being human. So yeah, that is certainly a poem that has great insights, I think, into how we deal with fear. Number 11 is Depression. Which poem illuminates your moments of darkness? And for this, I am going with Lady Lazarus by Sylvia Plath. Another poem that I had memorized for a time. I think I still have most of it memorized. But yeah, Sylvia Plath, I mean, you know, the sort of quintessential depressed poet. I mean, she's sort of become almost a meme in our culture, which is unfortunate, because she really was a very serious poet. You know, when I read her, I feel like, you know, her poems read sort of like Whitman, almost, sort of like they could have been just shouted out spontaneously somewhere, but really they're written with great control and skill. Lady Lazarus is certainly a great example of that. And you know, it's all about you know, sort of being resurrected after a suicide attempt. I've never had suicidal ideation of any sort, but I think that the idea of being resurrected following some great fall that you perceive you've had into depression or into some personal failing is incredibly resonant, and this poem is just a brilliant testament to that, as well as to overcoming depression. Yeah, anyway, that is the poem for every agony tag, and again, you should all go to watch Samuel's video and subscribe to his channel as well, because he's a great booktuber. You know, he's a writer, he's a playwright, poet, and novelist. He talks about his writing life, his reading life, so I wholeheartedly recommend you go subscribe to his channel. And also, on top of that, you should go and see if he tagged you, because again, if you're watching this video, there's a very good chance that he tagged you, because he tagged like everyone. I'm going to tag one person who I know he didn't tag. I'm going to tag Crystal at BiblioAtlas, one of the best poetry voices on BookTube. And yeah, so that is all. Give me your thoughts as always, and I will talk to you all later. Bye, guys.